Recently, there were articles going around about a researcher at Johns Hopkins who examined the CDC data and came to the conclusion that there were no increased deaths in 2020. The researcher then went on to claim that other causes of death were being misdiagnosed as coronavirus deaths. This fed into conspiracy theories that the government and the media were exaggerating the coronavirus problem. For some time, the right wing has been promoting a variety of conspiracy theories around the coronavirus. The most common being that the coronavirus isn't that deadly and the death numbers were faked or exaggerated. Adding fuel to these conspiracy theories, Johns Hopkins took down the article 4 days afterwards, saying that the article is being used to support false and dangerous inaccuracies about the impact of the pandemic. The right wing responded by claiming there was a cover-up going on. So what's going on here? How did the researcher come to this conclusion, and did they uncover a conspiracy around the coronavirus numbers? I looked it up, and the researcher discusses her research in an hour-long webinar. And she does some really strange things analyzing the data. At 20 minutes into her talk, she shows us this graph. Up here at the top is the total number of deaths. You can see there's more deaths in the winter, fewer deaths in the summer. And she shows us on this graph where the peak deaths in 2020 are 11,000 deaths more than the peak in 2018. And keep in mind that she's comparing January 2018 deaths against April 2020 deaths. And in a normal year, deaths are usually declining in April. And then she seems to admit that the spike in deaths is driven by COVID-19 deaths.
We do see a spike of death in 2020, which corresponds to COVID-19 death peak.
Alright, so I guess that settles it, and we're done with the video. I'm just kidding. This is actually where things start to go off the rails. She noticed that any time there is an increase in total deaths, that there's also an increase in individual causes of death. It looks like the middle of winter is a driving factor here. Now, this isn't a big revelation. Total deaths is dependent on individual causes of death, and a variety of different causes of death seem to peak in the winter each year. This is where she does something weird. She says, if there was a peak in total deaths in April 2020, then we should see a similar sized peak in heart attack deaths at the same time. But we don't. Therefore, that means that heart attack deaths are being underreported. She's hinting that heart attack deaths are being miscategorized as something else. She'll use this to claim that these heart attack deaths are being misreported as COVID deaths. This is of course nonsense. The reason heart attack deaths don't track with total deaths is because we have a new cause of death called the coronavirus. Now this next chart is zoomed in and it shows the causes of death without the total death numbers. I'll let you hear her argument in her own words.
During our period where we observe the peaks of total death, we see there was, during that peak, less heart attacks or deaths due to heart disease in 2020 than there were in 2018 by 367. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense at all. It doesn't make sense because, like we said earlier, right? Every peak, total death peak, corresponds to peak in all causes of death, right? It makes, right? We have more death from all the different causes, and that brings up the total death number.
I am completely baffled by her logic here because it doesn't make any sense at all. Essentially what she's arguing is that if total deaths increase for any reason, whether it's disease, famine, war, or whatever, then the number of heart attacks must also increase, and if it doesn't, then there must be something wrong with the data.
I seem to see a decrease, not an increase, from all the other causes. Is that right? So 2017-18, corresponding to the spike of total death, we have corresponding spikes in all causes of death. In 2020, corresponding to our total death spike, we not only have a lower than expected increase in heart attack, but also a decrease in all other causes of death.
So the argument she's making here is that other causes of death showed unexpected declines, and her suggestion is that other causes of death were being miscategorized as corona deaths. This inflates the coronavirus numbers while reducing the numbers for other causes of death. Now the first problem here is that she's looking at data in April, and when these causes of death are normally decreasing. And second, she neglects to mention that at the end of March, these other causes of death showed unexpected increases and then a corresponding decrease in April. My theory is that there's some corona deaths that were miscategorized as other causes of death. Here's some charts showing more clearly what was happening. The gray lines are the number of heart attack deaths in past years. As you can see, heart attacks shown in blue show an unusual increase around the beginning of April. The blue line then decreases back towards the average. And these charts also show an unusual increase in other causes of death around the beginning of April. If these charts were showing unusually low rates of death for other causes compared to previous years, then I'd say maybe she was onto something, but the rates in 2020 are actually slightly higher. What these charts suggest to me is the exact opposite of what she's saying. It suggests that coronavirus triggered some additional heart attacks, which makes sense since corona is known to cause blood clots, but these weren't categorized as coronavirus deaths. And also, the increased number of flu deaths makes me think that people died of coronavirus, but it was miscategorized as the flu.
All this points to no evidence that COVID-19 created any excess death. Total death numbers are not above normal death numbers. We found no evidence to the contrary. We do see a spike of death in 2020, which corresponds to COVID-19 death peak.
It's pretty obvious at this point that she flubbed the analysis of the CDC numbers. In fact, it's easy to just look at a chart of total deaths to see that the death numbers were higher in 2020 than they were in previous years.
We also found evidence that COVID-19 death numbers were misleading. We found evidence that some deaths caused by disease of the heart, chronic lower respiratory disease, flu and pneumonia, and more were simply reclassified as COVID-19 death.
This is simply untrue. The death numbers for other causes of death were not lower in 2020 than in previous years. So the conclusion here is pretty clear. She flubbed the analysis. People who think this is a conspiracy are wrong, and the article was taken down because the conclusion was just fundamentally wrong. I'd normally end the video here, but I wanted to make a quick comment about one of the books I saw while doing internet research. I showed this book earlier in the video, but I noticed a chart on the cover and I laughed. See if you can count the number of ways that it's wrong or misleading. I think this book cover is a good example of how to lie with statistics. Anyone casually glancing at this chart is going to say, dang, coronavirus deaths are nothing. The media and the government are blowing the whole thing out of proportion. I sure am grateful that these authors are telling us the truth that the government doesn't want us to know. Now, the first thing to notice is that the COVID death count ends on March 30th. I mean, I guess that's okay if they want to criticize the shutdowns beginning March 30th. The book wasn't published until almost 4 months after this, but whatever, we'll let that slide for now. First, the COVID death count wasn't 1,377 deaths on March 30th. The CDC website says that we are already at 3,851 deaths on March 28th. Another problem is that the chart is comparing deaths over the past 52 weeks against the COVID deaths that happened in the last 8 weeks. The first known COVID death in the US wasn't until the beginning of February, so the time spans are completely different. I mean, if they really wanted to downplay COVID deaths, why not compare it against all the deaths in the past decade or century? Another problem is that they don't acknowledge that infectious diseases can have an exponential growth rate. If you wait until it's a major cause of death, you've started fighting it way too late. You have to get out in front of these problems early and tackle them early. You need to handle the problem while it's still small. Here's what exponential growth looked like with COVID. If you do the math on this, heart attacks and cancer are killing an average of 1,600 to 1,800 Americans per day. You'd never know it from their chart, but COVID would surpass this death count and reach over 2,200 deaths on a single day on April 7th, literally 1 week after the March 30 shutdown. No, I haven't read this book, and they say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I'm going to bet the contents are pretty similar to the cover. And sadly, this book got a lot of positive reviews.